I mean, if I was thinking in a general term, in sort of wider terms, then I'd have to say the meltdown at WikiLeaks is quite interesting, and as much as that was an organisation which looked like it really had the media by the scruff of the neck in terms of how it was going to change things, and what we've been seeing recently is that as an organisation it's shown itself to be surprisingly insecure, disorganised, chaotic, and it's sort of lost all the trust that had been built up in it in a matter of months, really, which I think is a loss, probably. The best way for a new technology company to get onto my radar, generally the radar that I'm most sensitive to is Twitter, but of course there are other methods, email I do notice. The difficulty is all about what is the technology. There's no, what is a journalist on a national newspaper I'm looking for is something which is a story. Now, most companies don't have stories, all they have is an announcement, and an announcement is not the same as a story. A story will be plucky British inventor overcomes huge odds and manages to come up with world-beating product. So James Dyson, producing hundreds of prototypes of his Dyson vacuum cleaner in his house, then having to sue bigger established players and come through to become a successful name. That's a story because it has a whole arc. It has struggle against something. It has a change in the order that was there. However, if when he first had a vacuum cleaner, he said, "I've got a new vacuum cleaner." That's not a story, that's just an announcement. And you have to see that there are different levels in how things work. There's the announcement, there is the issue, as in where does this fit into what we're interested in. The way to get my attention is actually, it's a bit like X Factor, I guess. You've got to have the backstory, you've got to be making the journey, and that's something which I think is not easily appreciated within marketing, within PR, and within companies. Often people think it's enough simply to exist, but the trouble is that in the world of newspapers, news organisations, simply that isn't enough. My relationship with PR in my daily work is it's a mixture. I have to say, there's a lot of PR which goes on which is simply churning out press releases, which I know is driven entirely by the client. The client says, well, I think this is important, we should put it out. The PR may beg to differ, but then again, it's the client who's paying, the piper gets to call the tune. To the journalist, it's no use. I get lots of press releases every day which I simply delete unread. Now, the weakness there is that the PR isn't paying me and I'm not paying the PR. So clearly the client holds the financial reins here, so what the client wants, the client gets. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get coverage. So in that respect, PR to me can be a distraction, really. It sort of gets in the way of the more interesting emails I might have in my inbox. However, PR can be very productive when it puts me in touch with people who know about things that I want to write about, where people are sensitive to the issues that I'm covering closely. So I've had lots of good experiences where people get in touch and say, I notice that you are covering this area and we have something new in this area which we think adds to the story, and where that happens, it's great. Obviously setting up interviews with interesting people, that's all positive as well. My only complaint really with PR is when it becomes mechanised, when it's sort of just turning the handle, cranking out the press releases, ringing up to see if you got the press release. I think that's beneath the dignity really of the job. Start in July. That will give you the silly season, in which you probably have a better chance of getting things in. Didn't turn out that way in 2011 because it was an absolutely chaotic and mad year. But most years, you're probably going to get the sort of odd, easy survey, and perhaps if you can persuade someone to come through as an interesting interview, then they'll be someone who can get featured in the paper. I think it's more about finding interesting clients who can talk interestingly to the journalists than trying to manufacture a story or trying to push an announcement. I mean, I have a very low opinion of most of the surveys that are produced out of PR companies because simply they're not statistically rigorous, or else they're things which are obvious. I mean, I know that a lot of other media run them, and I can see how that could be scored as a hit, but I think that, again, it's not really something which actually is adding to the sum of human knowledge. I think PR works best when it puts the journalists and therefore the readers in touch with people who have interesting views, who are actually going to affect the way that we live our lives. So my advice would be, find the interesting clients, find the ones who are actually good in front of the journalist, and or perhaps in front of a microphone, and see if you can't get the journalists interested in them. The influence of Twitter is quite interesting. I mean, journalists, I know, all the national journalists use it as a really important way of keeping the finger on the pulse of what's happening or finding things out. So that, far more than Facebook and far more than LinkedIn, is a place where people find out what's going on, because it's so quick, because it's so direct. It just has, for journalists, there's simply nothing to match it.